Dora was in a hurry to get home. She was only out for half an hour to buy medicine for little Samuel. She stood in line for a long time, waiting for the pharmacist to give some bottles to a man who smelled bad breath. All the customers noticed and growled at him. But the pharmacist didn't care who bought what at the pharmacy, as long as profit was the main thing. Finally, Dora managed to buy the medicines she needed and rushed home. In addition to 10-month-old Samuel, she had 3 other children. She was considered a mother of many children and received certain payments from the state, but they were not enough. Her oldest son, Fernando, took care of the children at home. Although he was only 9 years old, the boy had the courage to help his mother in any way he could. He would change diapers and feed his little brother, put him to bed, and sing him a lullaby. On top of everything else, Dora had to work second shift. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, earning a meager salary on which the whole family survived. Her husband, Juan Carlos, died 3 months ago in an accident. He was hit by a car when the man was crossing the road at the wrong place. Dora was left alone with 4 children in her arms. But she was soon able to get back on her feet and get on with her life. She didn't dare leave her children with her neighbors, because they were mostly alcoholics or grumpy people. All they did was constantly ask her for money for drinks or complain about their miserable lives. Dora tried to reason with them and explain that she too had many problems, but they were marginal people who didn't even realize the abyss they were heading for. It was the kind of characters I had to live next door to. At the same time, she was used to them. She taught her children to avoid them. It wasn't enough that alcoholics and other outcasts began to bother them. No, Dora could not allow it and defended her family like an eagle. Her neighbors respected her and were a little afraid of her, so she had no nerves. In her haste to get home, Dora did not realize that she had tried to cross the road at the wrong place. At one point, the same thing that killed her husband almost happened. But at the last second, someone grabbed Dora by the sleeve of her blouse. She turned around and saw an old woman in old, tattered clothes. By all accounts, she was a beggar woman who didn't know where she had come from. The woman pulled Dora to the curb at the last moment. The mother of many children would have fallen under the wheels of a car. Just at that moment, a foreign car passed by at full speed. The driver didn't even think to slow down, although he was well aware that he was in the city, not on the highway. Dora exhaled sharply and lowered her head, guilty. At the same time, the beggar woman who rescued her looked to be about 60 years old. She did not look like an old woman. To be more specific, she was old enough to be Dora's mother. She had turned 32 this year and was, so to speak, in her prime. The stranger fixed her headscarf and looked at Dora sternly. "Why are you running so fast, my dear? You're going to the other world," she asked reproachfully. Blushing with surprise, or perhaps embarrassment at wanting to act so rashly, Dora replied quietly, "Yes, no, I was just in a hurry to bring home some medicine. My little boy is sick. And there are 4 children and no one to take care of them. My oldest son helps me, but he's only 9 years old." The beggar woman shook her head and invited Dora to sit on a bench near the bus stop. She didn't give off the smell that usually accompanied all homeless people. Dora also noticed that the woman took care of herself. Her fingernails were not dirty, her teeth were in place, as if by some fateful accident she had joined the ranks of the homeless. At the same time, the beggar expressed sympathy for Dora's difficult family situation. And she offered what would never have been expected of her. "Honey, how about I help you?" "Really?" Dora answered one question to another, furrowing her bushy eyebrows. "I love children," replied the beggar with a smile on her face. "By the way, my name is Marisol and I am pleased to meet you." "It's a pleasure to meet you, I'm Dora." She said her name. "I just didn't think you were." "I'm not underdressed," Marisol interrupted her. "That's a separate story, I'll tell you about it someday. And don't be afraid of me, I won't steal anything or hurt the children." Dora, however, had reasonable doubts about the woman. After all, she had never seen her and didn't even know what she really did for a living. Besides, she could have made up the beggar's name, so that there would be fewer questions. In general, Dora was at a loss and did not know whether or not to accept Marisol's proposal. In front of her she was a stranger, but, at the same time, the beggar's eyes radiated kindness. Dora saw in them a sea of positivity, as if the closest person was watching her. Thoughts like, "What if I trusted them, was there a catch?" were running through her head. At the same time, Dora was in a desperate situation. There was really no one to look after the children, even her friend was refusing. He had called her once to ask her to look after them, but she had told him she had a date with an interesting man. At that moment Dora even thought about her personal life, which had long since disappeared, and was unlikely to ever come. In any case, she was not worth counting on until the children came of age. Dora understood the hopelessness of the situation, so she gave herself entirely, without further ado, to their upbringing. There was nothing else she could do, her conscience would not allow it, and she would never forgive herself. After weighing the pros and cons, Dora accepted the proposal of the beggar Marisol. She had no other choice, and the woman didn't even mention money. It seemed that the woman was going to take care of her children for free. And this only spoke of great nobility on her part. In fact, Marisol could easily ask for payment and not make a gesture of goodwill. But no, it wasn't like that, and 20 minutes later they were at Dora's house. The apartment was tidy, which indicated that the landlady herself was pedantic. Marisol looked around and said cautiously, "Here you have a cozy and warm place." "I do what I can," Dora replied with a shrug, "but come in, we're going for a drink now." Hearing the noise in the hallway, the children came out, immediately perked up and started asking questions. "Who are you, Aunt, our grandmother?" Marisol had tears in her eyes, took a handkerchief out of her pocket and wiped her face. Realizing her confusion and emotion, Dora jokingly replied to the children, "Yes, it's Grandma, just for 1 hour." The last word had no effect on them. They still didn't understand what it meant. The main thing they heard was about the grandmother, everything else took a back seat. The children immediately smiled and started hugging the old woman. Suddenly, she was about to cry again, but managed to restrain herself. Looking at Dora, Marisol burst out laughing. The lady of the house also joined in with animated laughter. At the same time, little Samuel received a dose of medicine and felt a little better. Dora took his temperature, just in case, and it was within normal. After giving Marisol a cup, she started to get ready for work and gave her instructions. "If Samuel's temperature rises again, give him an antipyretic syrup." "Okay, I understand, you don't have to worry about anything," nodded the beggar. "I'll do everything as it should be done." "Yes, all the medicines are on the shelf in the cupboard," Dora continued explaining and pointed to the cabinet. "In case you want to eat, and I have already fed the children, there is soup, chops, and pasta in the fridge. And there are some baby foods on the kitchen table, Fernando knows them, he will show them to you. Everything will be fine, I didn't come for food." Marisol tried to calm her down. "You can go to work calmly and don't worry about anything." Dora nodded, and in her mind, she thought, "Yes, how can I not worry, they are my children and they are staying with a stranger." At the same time, her instinct told her not to worry. And his heart, by the way, was not tingling. Everything said that Marisol was not capable of hurting anyone. Therefore, Dora could go to work with the assurance that nothing would happen at home. But as she walked to the hospital, she kept having gloomy thoughts in her head. She couldn't stop thinking about how hard life had been for her. After her husband's death, Dora had a hard time, there was nowhere to wait for help, and among her acquaintances there were no supportive people. She had reached a dead end and had to do her best to find a way out. Fortunately, she still had willpower and character left. Dora could not even imagine what would have happened if she had let go of her hands. Most likely she would have been crushed by life's problems, figuratively speaking. And the children would have had to be placed somewhere, because there would have been no way to raise them. The outlook, to put it mildly, was not rosy. However, all this, to a large extent, Dora managed to avoid. And all thanks to her husband Juan Carlos, who, although an orphan, was able to find a way out of any situation. She remembered how they urgently needed to pay for the treatment of their eldest son, Fernando. Dora called everyone she knew at the time, but could not raise the money. So, the husband made a deal with a neighbor, who had always hated them, to help him finish building the garage. The neighbor, oddly enough, agreed. As a result, Juan Carlos ended up earning money for medicine. In fact, he overcame himself for the sake of the child. Dora remembered this, and now, when she had to think about who would take care of the children, she too put aside her principles and worries. Especially since, in reality, there was no one to trust in this situation. His parents had long since gotten drunk and died. It was useless to expect help from them. But in the old days, when they were still sober, Dora hadn't seen any good either. Her mother told her right away, "You're married, you're a grown-up, so you can do whatever you want." How could she expect help after saying that? Naturally, Dora gave up and stopped communicating with them. She was embarrassed to even approach them. She was in a hurry to get to work, but no matter how much she hurried, she was still late. The hospital director, Mr. Pablo was waiting for her in the waiting room. "Why are you late?" His formidable gaze made Dora shudder. "If it happens again, I'll fire you or deprive you of a bonus." Dora was about to cry, but she restrained herself. It crossed her mind, what is that bonus, just a few cents, and he wants to take it away from us, the bastard. But, of course, she didn't say it out loud. "I'm sorry, Mr. Pablo, it won't happen again." Dora bowed at his feet and slipped back into the nurse's office. Her colleague Elisa, who had come to work only a couple of months earlier, was already changing there. And also, as a nurse, because there were no other vacancies. When she saw Dora panting, she asked her with a smile on her face, "Hello, why are you breathing so hard? Were you being chased by wolves?" "Hi, if only." Dora shook her head. "I thought I would be on time for work, but I was still late." Our Pablo, as if by chance, was in the waiting room. "And how?" asked his companion with undisguised derision. "You'd better not ask," he told me in plain English. Dora waved her hand. "He threatened to fire me if I'm late again." "This one can," said Elisa sadly. "I hope I get my way," Dora replied with annoyance in her voice. "Listen, I always forget to ask you, who do you leave the children with when you go to work?" Elisa asked unexpectedly. "Normally with Fernando, my eldest son," Dora answered uncertainly, "but today a woman helped me. Or rather, a beggar woman. I met her by chance in the street. She saved me from death." "How is it?" "I tried to run across the road at the wrong place and almost got hit by a car." Dora shook her head, admitting her mistake. "Wow, what a gift of fate!" Elisa almost exclaimed. "And after that you invited her to your house?" "Well, yes, we agreed that she would take care of the children," Dora answered calmly. "Besides, Marisol, as the beggar woman is called, seemed to me to be a decent woman. Of course, I haven't seen her papers, but she looks about 60. I don't think people of that age are capable of any meanness." "Oh, you simpleton, you believed the first man you met." Her companion laughed in her face. "Are you crazy to leave your children with anyone? Surely, he's already taken over your apartment, and the children are running around hungry and calling for their mother." No, he won't do that." Dora shook her head negatively. "Well, let's get to work, or Senor Pablo will really fire us all." In principle, they had nothing to fear in case of dismissal, as the job of a nurse required all their energy and nerves. The pay was miserable and there were not many people in town willing to care for the sick. At the same time, there was not much choice, so she had to work where there was a steady paycheck. Dora took care of her patients, while Elisa was busy scrubbing the floors in the hallway. Cleaning the pots, she continued to think about how her children were doing. Her companion's doubts about the beggar girl were a thorn in her side. Dora worried that something might have happened to them. At one point she wondered if her friend was right. At the same time, Dora's intuition told her that all her worries were in vain, and that she was only winding herself up, causing herself even more problems, both emotional and quite tangible. Not noticing some abandoned slippers near one of the beds, she nearly tripped over them. She managed to keep her balance, but the container, with the remains of what was there, fell crashing to the floor. An old woman in the next bed grumbled and called for a doctor. A few minutes later Pablo came in and asked, "What happened? Why that noise?" "You should calm your nurse down, she won't let me sleep," the old woman murmured. "What happened, Dora?" asked the director sternly. "I didn't notice someone's slippers and almost fell," Dora tried to explain. "The bowl fell out of my hands, and the noise went all over the room. I'm reprimanding you, keep working." He waved his finger at her and left the room. The incident was over, but at the same time Dora was left with a bitter residue in her soul. She had been reprimanded for merely doing her job diligently. Once again, Dora was convinced that the position of nurse is a thankless one. She left the room, leaned against the wall, and wept softly. Elisa had just finished scrubbing the floors when she saw her in such a state. "Well, what happened? Who hurt you?" "As always, he touched my hot hand," Dora answered in tears and told her companion what had just happened in the living room. "No conscience, they could have said thank you." He shook his head, referring to the patients. "On the other hand, at their age it is to be expected. They are not happy to have lived to this age, they would have retired, but they won't let them." "Don't tell me." Dora perked up, calming down a bit. "I think I'm old sometimes, too, and it almost makes me sick to my stomach. It's very hard for them, and we still can't understand them." At that moment the conversation about the incident in the room ended, because the manager appeared and stared at them. Elisa went on to clean the floors, while Dora continued to walk through the rooms. Things got interesting with the manager. It turned out that he sympathized with Dora and even tried to court her. But he had children and a wife, and wanted to make the nurse his mistress. Dora knew this and rebuffed his advances by all means. She had no intention of becoming a concubine or having anything in common with such an unstable man. It was hard to expect anything good from him. Paul was furious, not understanding why Dora resisted. He offered her his love and gifts, promising to make her a queen. "If you give yourself to me, I will do anything for you," he would tell her when they were alone. "I'd rather be alone than with you." She shook her head negatively. This only annoyed Pablo, who was always looking for a reason to scold her. At the same time, today's tardiness had no effect. Pablo would only threaten to fire her, but nothing went beyond words. You could say he was patient with Dora. Except that she didn't want to accept his advances. The nurse couldn't even think about hooking up with a married man. Dora dreamed of a great love, of everything being mutual. Her favorite books were women's novels. In them she found comfort and relief. At the same time, she did not believe in fairy tales about princes. Girls made fun of them. At her age, she was ashamed to think of gifts of fortune. The nurse relied only on her own strength and what was useful to her. When she finished her rounds, she joined her partner and together they scrubbed the floors much faster. The nurses returned to their rooms. "I advise you not to pay attention to him," said Elisa, lighting the kettle. "If you mean the director, then I've already forgotten all about it." Dora shrugged. "Let's have some gingerbread, it's still fresh, it's not stale." Doing her work slowly, Dora didn't realize that it was morning and the end of her shift was approaching. She glanced at the clock and yawned involuntarily, muttering to herself, "Another night has passed." "Did you say something, Dora?" asked the director, suddenly coming up behind her. "Yes, I was happy for the patients that they are doing well," Dora replied confidently and without hesitation. "Naturally, they were under my supervision." Pablo beat his chest. Who would doubt it? Dora didn't answer, just nodded her head. At the same time, she barely had the strength to hold back her laughter. It was true what people said, that if you don't praise yourself, no one will. It seemed that the boss liked to beat his chest and prove to everyone that he was the best doctor. On the other hand, there was simply no one to question his professional skills. After waiting for her shift to end, Dora quickly changed clothes and ran home. She didn't even say goodbye to Elisa, who ran past her. Her partner did it for both of them. "Goodbye to you and me." The nurse shook her head and also left the hospital building. As she ran home, her heart almost leapt out of her chest. Dora was very worried about the children. She didn't know how they had spent the night, especially since they didn't have a spare phone. At the same time, Dora hoped that Marisol hadn't done anything to them. Something told the nurse that she had. Running into the courtyard and stopping near the entrance, the first thing she did was look at the windows. The kitchen vent was open and white steam was coming out. The first thing that came to Dora's mind was, she must be cooking something. And what was her surprise when, once on the floor, she saw lush pancakes on the table. The children immediately came out of their rooms, looking well fed and clean. It seemed that the beggar had already fed and bathed them. To be honest, Dora was surprised to see this. "You are a miracle worker, Marisol," praised the beggar. The eldest son, Fernando, took little Samuel in his arms and said proudly, "Mom, he's better now, he no longer has a fever." Dora brought her lips to his forehead and was surprised to find that it was not warm. "Wow, and before that he had a fever since morning," he shook his head. "I made her a herbal compress," the beggar replied. The syrup was also good for her, but folk medicine was better. "I don't know what to say." Dora was confused. "I thought there would be mess and dirt, is that what you meant?" Marisol added to her thoughts. "Well, not exactly, but something like that." Dora nodded. "And now, I look and I can't believe my eyes." "Yes, don't look so surprised, I promised you everything would be alright," said the beggar woman with her head tilted to one side. "They sit at the table and have some pancakes and coffee. The children are fed, but if they want more, there is enough for everyone." Dora could not contain herself and cried, then hugged the beggar girl. "You are my guardian angel." These words were a balm for Marisol's soul. Once they had calmed down a bit, the women sat down at the table for coffee and pancakes. They were so delicious that Dora didn't realize she had eaten 3 in a minute. After satisfying his morning hunger, he cautiously asked, "Excuse me for asking, but how did you end up in this situation?" "You know, Dora, there's not much to tell," shrugged Marisol. "I barely remember anything. I woke up in a ditch with no documents or money. It happened almost a year ago. They smashed my head in, I could barely stand up." "It's terrible. Wasn't there anyone around?" With her hands pressed against her face, Dora asked with regret in her voice. "Well, then," Marisol replied with a shrug, "some vagabonds picked me up and took me to their hut. There they gave me some clothes, because mine were in bad shape. I don't know how long I was in that ditch. So, I wore what they gave me, because I had no other choice." "How did this happen in the first place?" "I don't remember, Dora, for the life of me, I don't remember anything else." Marisol shook her head. "Did you try to go to the police?" Dora continued asking. "You're kidding, of course I tried," Marisol replied with annoyance in her voice. "I went there, explained my situation, but they didn't even accept the application." "I don't understand, have they stopped protecting people?" Dora was surprised. "There was a district policeman named Gomez, and he kicked me out. And he also said that I prevented him from helping decent people. Tell me, Dora, am I not a decent person and do I not deserve respect?" The beggar girl cried again, and then Dora held out a handkerchief. "No, it's not like that. You're a good person," reassured Marisol. "You just ran into a bad cop. If you're not a relative or friend, you'll wait your turn until the seventh coming." "That's probably why I left without getting help." The beggar shook her head. "I feel sorry for you, Marisol, you are a hostage of circumstances," said Dora, "and as for the police, it is nothing more than a system that cannot be eradicated." Deep down, Dora not only sympathized with the poor woman, but was annoyed that no one had helped her. The woman had lost her memory and was on the margins of life. After reflecting on her problems, Dora suggested, "Stay at my house, there's plenty of room, and the children, I understand, are glad to see you." "Are you sure about that?" Marisol asked cautiously. "I just wanted to help a little." "I am grateful to you, so I ask you to continue taking care of the children," Dora insisted. "I work in shifts, as a nurse in the hospital, I can say that often the children are left alone." "I understand, Dora, and I agree to help," nodded Marisol, "especially since I have nowhere else to go." "It's too soon to give up," said Dora. A smile of happiness appeared on Marisol's face for the fact that she could now live in human conditions and stop wasting time looking for food. Once it was agreed what to do and at what time, Dora continued to work quietly. The head of the hospital did not let up in his efforts to flirt. But each time she ran into a wall of alienation, as if she were banging her head against it. Dora wanted nothing to do with him, so she avoided Pablo, if possible. At the same time, her companion Elisa kept teasing the beggar girl. One day they were sitting in his office and she asked him, "Well, have you taken everything out of the apartment yet?" "My God, where did you get that idea?" Dora replied reluctantly. "We have a total love affair with her. I've never met anyone who could help like that." "Surprisingly, there are a lot of people like that everywhere," Elisa replied with a shrug. "Name me someone to help you?" suggested Dora. "That, you see, He hesitated to answer. "You see, no one has helped," said Dora, "and I don't think they will, unless there is a direct benefit in it." "You know, my friend, you're right," Elisa nodded, "and forgive me for being mean to that beggar. Her name is Marisol, and she's old enough to be my mother and yours," Dora corrected her. "And let's say no more about this poor woman. Life has already taken her to the bottom, and now we are gossiping." "Yes, Dora, that's it, I'll shut up," nodded her companion, running her fingers over her lips. "All right, let's get to work." Dora patted him on the shoulder and they left to go about their duties. This was the last conversation that mentioned Marisol. Elisa was no longer trying to pick on Dora. On the contrary, she began to wonder how she was doing. It seems that her partner also felt sympathy for her. Especially since Dora said that Marisol had lost her memory. For Elisa there was probably nothing worse than such a problem. Whenever she could, she passed things on to the beggar through Dora. Elisa's mother had died 6 months earlier, and she had a lot of clothes left from her. She didn't dare throw them away, but then chance itself helped her to keep them. Marisol thanked Elisa in return and treated her to a cup of coffee and cake. That said, the beggar girl was a good cook. Except she couldn't remember where she had gotten her skills. 3 weeks had passed since her arrival at Dora's apartment. In that time, Marisol had completely adapted to normal life. Moreover, the children had become accustomed to her and, strangely enough, called her grandmother. They thought she had gone away for a while and then returned. Especially since their mother didn't even think to dispel their assumptions. And so they lived, as they called it, as one big family. But soon an event occurred that threw them completely off balance. The doctors discovered that the eldest son had a heart defect. Earlier he had complained of malaise and headaches. But here the doctor was directly shocked by such a diagnosis. Naturally, Dora started running around looking for money for an operation. At the hospital, they said that if it was not done as soon as possible, it would be a ticking time bomb. In such a case, no one could guarantee what would happen next. The doctors threw their hands on their heads. They did what they could, of course, but their strength was not unlimited. Dora could only hope that the charitable foundation where she applied for help would help her. They promised to support her even there if the necessary amount was raised. As time passed, there was no progress in this regard. Dora was literally torn between home and work, and she couldn't get the mystery of Marisol, who had lost her memory, out of her mind either. Could it be that she had no relatives? It was clear that someone had to look for this woman. True, who and where, Dora did not know, but she hoped to get the information soon. Besides, she herself wanted to help Marisol find her relatives. At a time when money needed to be raised for her son's operation, Dora got volunteers to look for the beggar's relatives. She told them briefly what had happened to her. And she provided them with the photos from her phone when she took Marisol's picture. The volunteers promised to scour the whole neighborhood for any clues. "We will do our best," assured the group leader, Alejandro. "I have no one else to trust," Dora replied. "My son needs an expensive operation, so I'm running around like a squirrel on a wheel." "Maybe we can help you here too?" asked Alejandro cautiously. "No, it's bad enough what you're doing." Dora shook her head. "I can take care of my son by myself." The volunteers initiated a search and were in constant contact with Dora. So far, however, they had little to share. No one knew Marisol in the places where homeless people used to go. They would show them her photos, but they would simply deny, repeating the same phrase. "We don't know anything, we don't know anything." It is surprising that Marisol spent so much time among the homeless and they did not remember her. Or maybe they just didn't want to get involved for fear of being stopped by the police. After all, many of them were already in trouble with the law. For example, lack of documents. The homeless were not bothered by this fact, but the law enforcement officers were quite interested. If they found a homeless person without papers, they would check him in the database and then, if there were no problems with the law, they would hold him for 15 days to work it out. That's why the homeless people didn't contact the volunteers. On the other hand, they wouldn't have been able to tell them anything worthwhile. Marisol herself said she had woken up in a ditch. But she had no memory of how she got there. The result was a vicious circle from which there was no way out. At the same time, the volunteers were still looking for her, because they had promised Dora that they would do their best. Meanwhile, the nurse also searched for Marisol's possible origins. Dora used social networks and other internet resources. Marisol watched her actions and only lamented. "I think nothing will come of this." "Why do you think so?" asked Dora. "If I had loving relatives, they would have found me long ago," replied Marisol ironically. "And yet, I will try to find them, if I can," Dora continued. "I totally agree, especially since I don't feel comfortable embarrassing you," said Marisol with her head down. "I am not ashamed of you," said Dora. "Put aside all those gloomy thoughts," she commanded. "Just look how lively the children were when you came. It's a fairy tale, not a reality." "Maybe you're right, and it's worth looking for those who are as worried about me as you are," Marisol agreed with her. "That's right, you mustn't give up," Dora confirmed her intentions. She then continued her search, which soon became known in her work. And while her colleague Elisa merely supported her, the rest of the staff laughed mischievously. Some even twiddled their thumbs, saying, "Yes, you're crazy to help a beggar. She is just an ordinary woman with many difficulties in her life." Dora tried to change their minds. "You don't understand anything about her, so you judge her from a high place." In general, almost everyone on the team, with the exception, again, of Elisa, thought the beggar was just messing with her head. And they tried to dissuade Dora from continuing her search. They even offered to put Marisol in a homeless shelter. But Dora refused and sent everyone off in a familiar direction. She was not the type of person to stop in the face of hardship. Dora believed that everything would work out and they would find Marisol's relatives. She kept raising money for her son's operation, and even started working part-time as a cleaner. But it still wasn't enough, and meanwhile the clock was ticking slowly. Dora could see that her son was hanging on, but she found it increasingly difficult to keep calm. Fernando loved his mother, so he convinced himself that she would find the money for the operation. And she would no longer have to live in constant anticipation of a tragic end. At the same time, the hospital supervisor was driving Dora to the brink of a nervous breakdown. She had no time to think about love games, and he was not letting up. So, she answered him harshly. "Could you go away, Pablo, for a long time and far away? I have enough problems as it is, and now you're messing with me. Have you completely lost your fear? Have you been filling your head with this beggar girl? Wake up, she's not worth it, you're wasting your time. There's something wrong with your brain. You have a wife, so bother her. And as for the beggar, as you called her, she's a human being like everyone else." "Yes, I'll have you," smiled the manager and tried to grab her. By this time, the staff had already started to gather in the hallway. They heard the noise and decided to ask what was going on. They were surprised when they picked up a fight between the head of the hospital and a nurse. Naturally, they couldn't miss it. "What are you doing here? Isn't there enough work?" Pablo shouted at them. "You should shout louder, so the patients can hear too," Dora teased. "Well, you don't work here anymore anyway," he summarized. "I've fired you, pack up your stuff and leave." "All right, as you say." The staff clicked their tongues and whispered in surprise. They had not expected such a climax. Everyone expected the director to calm down and the conflict to be resolved peacefully. But no, Pablo went all out and fired Dora. One could say that this outcome was to be expected, because there had been a cat in the bag between them for a long time. Dora refused intimacy, and he was humiliated. Naturally, the director couldn't stand it and put on a show in front of everyone. He thought Dora would freak out and apologize. But she didn't. The nurse wasn't shy and stood up to him. In doing so, she shook the director's credibility in the eyes of his subordinates. Now he could not count on her loyalty when it came to dealing with difficult matters. However, this did not bother Dora at all. She collected the rest of the settlement and left the hospital. But before saying goodbye at all, she visited her former colleague. She was shocked to learn what had happened. Elisa was on another floor at the time. "I can't believe I did that," he was indignant. "It's all right, we'll get through this," Dora reassured her, or maybe she reassured herself. "What are you going to do now?" asked Elisa. "I will look for another job. There are private clinics," Dora answered calmly. "But you need favoritism there," said Elisa with a shrug. "I know, but I'll figure something out," nodded Dora. "Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. I've been through worse, life doesn't stop." "You are an optimist," said Elisa in amazement. "I'm amazed at myself," smiled Dora, "but not long ago, when Juan Carlos died, I didn't even know how to go on living. Then it seemed to me that the whole world was going black and the earth was turning upside down. Can you imagine what it's like to be left alone with 4 children in your arms?" "Vaguely, to tell you the truth," Elisa shrugged. "I don't have children yet. But the situation you just mentioned could happen again." "Never mind, keep your spirits up," Dora winked and left the hospital building. Now he had nothing more to do in that place. True, it was a pity that his work experience had been interrupted. On the other hand, Dora had a lot of problems that needed to be solved urgently. The other day she heard from some volunteers that they had found the threads. Realizing that she would have to contact relatives, Dora went to the volunteers, but they only gave her the address of Marisol's son. As it turned out, he was also looking for his mother. However, Eric lived 90 kilometers away, in a neighboring town. Dora, of course, had a reasonable question. "Why couldn't I find it?" "We don't know, Dora," the volunteers answered together. "We found it by pure chance." "How is that possible?" asked Dora, surprised. "We also work with animal shelters," said Alejandro. "So, Eric went there to take in Princess, a kitten. She, as you can see, missed her owner and gave no one any respite." "I don't understand, what's the cat got to do with it?" asked Dora. "Princess belonged to Marisol," Alejandro continued. At the shelter, Eric shared his misfortune with one of the employees. That's how we found Marisol's son through him. How is it possible that, had they not brought the cat, they would have continued looking for him? Dora suggested. Probably, yes, nodded Alejandro. Take Eric's address, go tell him the good news. We didn't do it ourselves, we thought you'd surprise him. There really will be a surprise, Dora agreed with him. Thanks, guys, I owe you one. It was interesting to participate in the search ourselves, said Alejandro. Dora took the brochure with the address of Marisol's son. Naturally, she didn't say anything to Marisol yet. She had to see for herself that it was really the beggar's son. After what Alejandro had said about the shelter and the cat, Dora suspected that Eric himself might get rid of his mother. If the cat bothered him, it wouldn't be hard to send a person to the other side as well. The truth is, he could have put her in a retirement home. Anyway, there was no guessing, and Dora set off to meet Eric. She was going to visit a neighboring town. But first she gave Marisol some advice. Don't spoil them too much with sweets, they will get used to it. Are you leaving for a long time? Asked Marisol cautiously. I think one day, maybe two, but no more, Dora answered thoughtfully. Immediately, the children came out to her and began hugging their mother. She smiled back and kissed each one on the cheek. But, of course, it was little Samuel and her oldest son, Fernando, who got the most attention. The boys smiled too, except that Fernando's smile was a little strained. But he resisted so as not to disturb his mother. She was on her way on important business. Dora waved goodbye from the cab, lowered her head sadly, and wept. At that moment it all came crashing down on her, as if all her problems had collapsed on her head at once. Under the weight of his gloomy thoughts, he made his way to the train station to take the first one to the neighboring city. It took him about 3 hours to get there. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Dora arrived at the address, which was an elegant 3-story house. It looked like a mansion, because Dora had never seen anything so beautiful. The owner of the house was probably an art connoisseur and a professional designer. Shivering from the cold, Dora approached the door and rang the doorbell. After a few minutes, footsteps sounded and a man between 30 and 35 appeared on the threshold. He looked at Dora and then jerked his chin as if asking who he was and what he wanted here. Dora was confused for a few seconds, but then pulled herself together and took a photograph out of her purse. The landlord was surprised to see it. Where did you get it, and where is my mother? His hands were shaking as if he were stealing chickens. It's all right, she's at my house, Dora answered calmly. But I wonder how Marisol found herself in another city without her memory. Marisol Akaf, the landlord, corrected her. Ah, well, yes, I didn't know that, Dora replied. You are Eric, if I'm not mistaken? Yes, and how do you know my name? The man answered question by question. Never mind, I was helped by kind people, she said. By the way, my name is Dora. And I met your mother, or rather, we met by chance. Come inside, we'll talk there, Eric invited her, letting her in. Dora walked in and was even more surprised. The outside beauty was just flowers. The real brightness was inside the house. There was antique furniture, paintings, and marble tiles on the floor. In general, the owner knew how to furnish his house in a comfortable and cozy way. He noticed Dora's confusion and told her cautiously, "Everything belongs to my father, he was an antique dealer." I see, nodded Dora, and I thought you had bought everything. No, I'm just an ordinary middle-class businessman, Eric waved his hand. My father didn't go into business, but I did. He did what he liked, and I went into business. That's all very well, of course, said Dora, but what I can't understand is how your mother's disappearance happened. It happened a year ago, Eric began to tell the story. I bought my mother a ticket to go to the sea. She had wanted to go there for a long time. But soon after she left, she disappeared, her phone went silent, and I didn't know what to do. Have you tried looking for her? Asked Dora. Of course, I went all over town, but no luck, Eric nodded. It's strange, with your money you couldn't find the mother, said Dora thoughtfully. Don't look at that luxury, Eric repeated. I'm not a tycoon to throw money around. I understand, nodded Dora. Get ready to go see your mother, maybe she'll remember something. What's wrong with his memory? Eric asked in horror. I don't know, probably amnesia after the stroke, shrugged Dora. Was she beaten? There are too many questions, you'll find out, Dora interrupted him abruptly. Okay, I'll start the car and call Alicia to tell her I'm going on business, said Eric and started to get ready. Who is Alicia, if it's not a secret? Asked Dora. It's as if she were my fiancée, Eric replied uncertainly. What do you mean as if? Dora interjected. You see, we still can't get married, Eric replied with annoyance in his voice. And what's stopping you? Insisted Dora. First my mother disappeared, Eric began to enumerate, and then other problems. Well, I made it clear that until they found my mother, no marriage. Tough on her, Dora shook her head. You could have married, especially since it's been so long. Let's not talk about my fiancé, Eric asked. The mother is important to me now. 3 hours later, they arrived in Dora's hometown. She remained silent all the way, listening to music over the loudspeakers, while he called his fiancée and assured her that he was gone on business. Finally, as they approached his apartment, Dora asked quietly, Well, are you ready? Yes, open the door, Eric nodded. The key turned in the lock a couple of times, there was a click and then the door creaked open. A few seconds later, Marisol peeked into the hallway. Seeing her, Eric shouted across the floor, Mom, God, you're alive. Dora, is that my son? Marisol, bewildered, pointed to him and shouted. Yes, that's him, Mrs. Aucalf, Dora replied calmly, adding her last name for completeness. It can't be, my son, I don't believe it, Marisol continued sobbing. It is I, Mother, Eric, your own son, your blood. He held out his hand and tried to embrace her. Marisol did not pull away and embraced Eric as well, although Dora hoped that the encounter would go modestly. In any case, since she had memory problems, she should not have counted on emotions. However, it was different. Marisol cried when she knew she had her son in front of her. And at the same moment she said aloud, That's right, I remembered, it was your fiancé's fault. What do you mean? What does that mean? Eric asked with undisguised surprise. Wait, what's wrong with me? Marisol made a gesture with her hands and started to bend down. Eric and Dora lifted Marisol up and carried her to the sofa. The children, meanwhile, watched the television noisily, but then abruptly fell silent. Looking at their mother, they nodded and stopped braying. Gasping, Marisol looked at everyone with teary eyes and muttered, My son should never have messed with her, he knew there would be trouble. The stress of seeing him had gotten to him and he slowly began to remember the events of a year ago. It turned out that Marisol had actually gone to the sea. She wanted to relax on the warm sand and, at the same time, get some of the southern sun. Eric booked her a stay for a few weeks in a nice hotel where the sea was only a 3-minute walk away. He thought he was giving his mother a present. Eric's fiancée was to blame for his problems. It was she who incited her friends to hit Marisol over the head. However, they also managed to wave goodbye. Remember, you old and senile woman, where you are going, leave Alicia alone and don't bother her and Eric, said Marisol. Are you serious, Mom? Eric asked in horror. Yes, son, although it sounds strange, your Alicia wanted to kill me, nodded Marisol. She went on to say that at first, she had been opposed to their relationship. Marisol saw through this Alicia and felt in her heart that there would be problems. That is why she insisted that they sign a marriage contract. At the time, Eric still doubted the advisability of such formalities. But his mother convinced him that it would be best and in the end he agreed. The bride, on the other hand, flatly refused. Eric even had to persuade her to approve the marriage contract. But then his mother went to sea and disappeared. I knew your relationship wouldn't go well, Marisol growled through her teeth. I'm sorry, Mother, for God's sake, cried Eric. I was so blind as a kitten that I didn't notice anything around me. Now your eyes are open, said Dora. What are you going to do with Alicia? I'll figure it all out now, Eric replied angrily and started to call someone. It turned out that he had asked his friends to shake down his fiancée, now his ex-fiancée, to get all the information about his mother's unfortunate murder. She, under his pressure and fearing for her life, confessed everything and ratted out his accomplices. They were soon arrested and during the investigation they declared that everything had been planned by Alicia. It was she who convinced the bandits to ambush Marisol at the nearest station and kill her. They did, but they took no chances and accompanied the train 90 kilometers from their hometown. There Marisol got off at the station to buy water, they chose a moment, beat her and waved before finishing her off. But someone scared them. So, they threw Marisol's body into a ditch, took out her documents and money, and fled. In this way, they covered their tracks so that, in any case, the case would be investigated in another city. However, Alicia was told that the case was done and they received money from her. Eric was stunned when he heard all this. Naturally, the wedding was out of the question. He didn't even go on the date Alicia had asked him to. For him, she was a thing of the past, like what had once brought them together. Now the whole gang was preparing to stand trial and answer for the crime they had committed. The investigator promised that they would receive the maximum penalties provided for in this article of the Penal Code. So, justice has been done and everything has fallen into place. Eric finally found his mother and his fiancée went to jail for attempted murder. Marisol soon regained her memory completely. And she was glad to know that her son had been waiting all this time. She took Princess from the shelter, as she still failed to find new owners. At the same time, his relationship with Dora began to take on a life of its own. Especially because his mother approved of them. But she also demanded that her son do everything possible to save Fernando. Eric found the best doctors and took the boy to a specialized clinic. There they examined him and assured him that an operation would save Fernando's life. Dora was very worried about her son, visited him every day and prayed to God that everything would be all right. The doctors at the clinic performed the operation and it was a success. The family received happy news. All of Dora's children literally adored Eric for saving their older brother. Meanwhile, the relationship between Dora and Eric had reached a new level. Eric started hinting that it wouldn't be a bad idea to get married. And, oddly enough, he wasn't even intimidated by becoming, so to speak, the father of such a large family. Dora was delighted when Eric proposed to her. It happened in the park, where they were walking as a family. The children and Eric's mother watched out of the corner of their eyes. In fact, Marisol became her own grandmother. She hugged the children, sobbed and said, "For better or worse, for the rest of my life, I agree to be your wife." Dora replied loudly, causing the pigeons to fly and circle above them. It was a good sign that two hearts in love had found each other. Reaching over and taking the hands of Dora's children, Marisol blessed their marriage. "And be happy that your family is the strongest." "Thank you, Marisol," Dora thanked her. "Thank you, Mom," Eric added. "Now I won't let you go anywhere, because we'll all be together." 2 weeks later, they were married. Eric immediately told Dora that they would live in his house. Dora's apartment was exchanged for 2 one-bedroom apartments in Eric's town for rent to tenants. Incidentally, Fernando was recovering from surgery and was released just before his mother and Eric's wedding. She took part in the festivities and congratulated the newlyweds wholeheartedly. And, strangely enough, for the first time she called Eric Daddy, although she had been suspicious of him until then. On the other hand, it was impossible not to realize how much good he had done them. And, above all, he had saved his life by paying for the operation. Fernando was grateful to Eric, so he accepted him into his family with a light heart. After the wedding they began to prepare for the move, so as not to be delayed. But then Dora remembered that she had a debt to pay. Eric wondered to whom she had not given the money. "When will you have managed to borrow it?" "No, it's not about the money," Dora objected. "I need to put someone in his place so he doesn't get into trouble again." Finally, Eric took her to the same hospital from which she had recently been dismissed. Dora easily found the boss, Senior Pablo, who was making his rounds among the patients. Unashamed, as soon as she entered the room, she began to tell him everything she thought of him and what he deserved. You could say that Dora had embarrassed the director. And she had also reprimanded him about his love affairs, for all the other female employees to know. To his misfortune, his wife arrived at the hospital and found out everything. There are no words to describe what happened next. Pablo was looking for a fifth corner to hide from his furious wife. But he still got beaten up, and thank goodness he survived. After such a beating, he instantly lost his desire to flirt around. Now his wife was watching him, and he was afraid of her. Eventually, the business ended and it was time to leave town. When Dora and the children arrived in a new place, they quickly adjusted. Marisol returned home, and the first thing she did was donate money to volunteers and to the shelter where her beloved princess had spent time. Meanwhile, Eric somehow hinted that it would be nice to have a fifth child. Dora responded with a sweet smile and a sly look. If you liked the story, please like and subscribe to the channel.